Okay, we're going to have a look at the current state of European politics right now on a brief video. Obviously, we were seeing with Brexit and the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland neo-Nazi far-right party in Germany and the rise of the right wing in France and a populist party taking over the Five Star Movement in Italy. There is a shift from mainstream politics happening. Many people, mostly young people, and those from working class backgrounds are getting exceptionally frustrated with what they perceive is the elite politicians failing them. And there are one or two areas where they are right, and other areas they're playing on these populist or these right or left wing parties are playing on the fears of the majority. And we have to trace this back about a decade ago. So about 2007, 2008 is where the effects of the financial crisis are now being felt happened. Obviously, banking crisis in America and Europe and Asia took hold over a couple of years. Northern Rock was one of the banks that failed. RBS, Fannie Mae, Lehman Brothers, many medium and large banks failed because of the subprime lending that they were doing, which was completely irresponsible and wrong. And a lot of the westernized economies were basically built up upon unsustainable debts, and some of those economies are still really struggling with those unsustainable debts. What has then happened in Europe is the euro crisis, the refugee crisis, the austerity measures, especially if you look at countries. I'm using Greece as an example that in our lifetimes probably will never pay that debt off. They're going to be indebted to predominantly Germany for several generations, maybe 100 or so years. There are some calling for the return of the drachma in Greece. There's 40% youth unemployment. So this is a fertile breeding ground for more extreme populist parties to gather support. What we've seen over here in the UK is, yes, there has been austerity measures. There has been. And not all of them have been very popular. I'm going to admit that. I'm going to say that. As someone who's actually lived through and had to experience some of these austerity measures, no, it hasn't been fun. It's not been enjoyable. But what was happening before then was an overinflated public sector. And the issue is, where do you cut? Now, I agree with the cuts in principle, but not with how they've been implemented. The issue with the public sector is there are lots of middle management who are earning massive salaries when their wage bracket, that money could be spent on frontline services such as teachers, teaching assistants, paramedics, police officers, nurses, doctors, the military, frontline rather than middle management who may not actually have experience in the frontline service itself. They're just pen pushers. And a lot of this middle management position has happened in the previous 20 years. And that's a problem. We've now reached an issue and a point where a lot of young people are feeling disenfranchised. The working and middle classes, a lot of them are feeling disenfranchised as well. On the left wing, many of the minority groups are arguing more for equal rights, and that is totally acceptable. But the way it's been handled, there's a militancy there, and on the right and the extreme right, especially, they're looking at the fears that a lot of the mainstream people have, a lot of the mainstream workers have, those who are struggling to earn a decent wage, those who've had their savings that are affected because of low interest rates, repossessions on their houses if they had mortgages. So the working middle classes have actually been really hammered over the last decade or so. And there's high youth unemployment in some areas. Some areas are really bad for youth unemployment. And the populist, mostly right wing, but some left wing parties are feeding off this anxiety and this fear. And what has happened is the mainstream centrist, centre-right, centre-left parties and the centrist parties are, feeling a fallout from various policies they've enacted pre-crisis and post-financial crisis. And in the last decade, we're seeing bigger swings away from the centre towards the left in this hand and the right in this hand, and then we're getting onto the nasty far right and hard left, which is basically neo-Marxist and neo-Nazi parties. And we are seeing violent protests in the streets. We're seeing strike action. Look at France right now. There's a fuel strike. Emmanuel Macron is a centrist, and he's a very unpopular president. Much like Francois Hollande wasn't very popular, and Nicolas Sarkozy. He comes from that line of presidents from the centre, centre-left, centre-right. All three of them were exceptionally unpopular during their time in charge. All three of them have basically been in charge post-financial crisis. None of them are very popular. for various reasons. It's interesting that Macron was part of Hollande's government and then undermined that government to then form his own party and get into power. Is the far right under Marianne Le Pen came second in that presidential election, and they still have vast amounts of support within the working class, within the middle classes, and they're not going away, and they are anti-EU. So this anti-EU populist movement is growing as well. The Five Star movement in Italy, they were told by the EU they couldn't appoint their own finance minister because he was too anti-EU for them. That is the EU now meddling in domestic politics of a domestic member state. That's where things like Brexit have come from. I do believe the EU is a positive more than a negative, but it needs reform. And that argument, the reform of it, is being lost because the mainstream EU is very, very blinkered and rigid in its direction. The EU project cannot deviate course. They're not pragmatic enough. Whereas those who are anti-EU are also being very short-sighted in the fact that there is chance, if member states actually raise enough concerns and enough of them actually speak up, that they can reform and be more flexible. And again, this is what people aren't seeing, is because the euro is the main currency of the EU, not the only currency, but the main currency. It's pegged to the old German Deutschmark. That doesn't suit countries like Spain with the old peseta, Greece with the old drachma, and Italy with the old lira, or even France with the old French franc. Because the Deutschmark was set, that's what the euro set at. It suits the German economy really well, and the Austrian and the Benelux economies decently well. Scandinavia, not so much, because of what their currency is worth. Hence why Sweden, Denmark don't have the euro, but Finland does for some reason. So there's that to consider, and the economic policies are having an effect, and the enforced austerity is not going down well with mainstream voters. They are getting really turned off by some of the diktats, I think, from Central Europe, and massive youth unemployment is a concern, especially when you have militant parties like those on the far right and the hard left who are now got a nice pool of recruits, angry young people who are disenfranchised. This happened in the 30s and the 20s with high unemployment and economic crisis beginning of the last century. It's happening again now, and it's fertile breeding ground for very extreme parties. The final nail in the coffin of the last decade is this refugee crisis from the Middle East, and obviously the conflict in North Africa and the Middle East is brutal. Many people have been displaced, and again the left and the right are playing with people's lives with the politics that they are pursuing, and people are voting for these parties because the media is whipping up a sense of hysteria and sometimes misreporting what's happening. There are actual incidents of gang violence and crime related to a minority of these refugees and these economic migrants, and that's been stoked. And the far right or the hard left, depending on what nation they're in, will take that fear and put it into their election manifestos and seek to blame insert party here. Now, what has made and inflamed this divide in Europe is Angela Merkel's open door policy. I really don't think that the German Parliament and Angela Merkel, as Chancellor, really consulted the other member states of the EU, because the austerity measures that the Germans have really enforced upon the rest of Europe. Greece is the front line of this wave from the Middle East. Southern Italy and Malta are the front line of this wave. Southern Spain. I don't think there was a coherent plan when she came up with the policy idea, and I don't think she reached out enough to her EU partners really for it to be effective. And what we're seeing is the poorer countries are being swamped. They are. Their services are being cut back so much by austerity that there's not enough police officers and immigration officers and welfare officers to process all these people. And most of these immigrants want to go to Germany anyway, and then to the promised land of Scandinavia, where there's a very, very healthy benefits system and welfare system, and here in the UK. And there are other nations in Northern Europe, such as Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, who've got very, very good social security, very, very good living standards, higher wages. And we're now seeing these shanty towns at channel ports We're seeing, real nasty protests. We're seeing a lot of negativity, and it's caused by lack of foresight and lack of communication between the German government and the other 27 governments of the EU. Pretty much, it's Germany's way or the highway, it seems, and that's again where this anti-EU feeling comes from. Um, it has had an effect in Germany. Her government is weaker now. It's a coalition, and she's no longer in charge of her party. So she is actually saying she'll stay until the end of her parliamentary term. But I don't see how she can do it. And unfortunately, if Germany goes into a political crisis, it could seriously screw up Europe. But the euro is another crisis away from collapse. Um, it, if Greece has any more financial issues or another struggle, or if another euro member nation has some issues, the euro could be in deep trouble as a currency. It is a political currency, not an economic one. But that's the state of European politics over the last decade. There's several things that are going on. I will say this: when the banking crash happened, if people like Alistair Darling, as Chancellor of the Exchequer here in the UK, didn't act in the way they did, the situation would have been far worse in the long term. But what that led to was a lack of trust in the then governing Labour Party, which was a centre-left, just centre-left party at the time. It's since gone further to the left as time has gone on. It led to a lack of trust in them, so they lost the election, but there wasn't enough support for the Conservative and Lib Dem parties to form an overall majority, which led to a coalition government here in the UK, which has had its own effects on the political landscape here, being very, very similar to Europe, but for different reasons. We've seen rises in regional nationalist movements for independence, Catalonia in Spain, Scotland in the UK. Obviously, we've seen the Ukraine crisis and how the EU dealt with that as well. So there's a lot to consider when we look at politics in Europe right now. But I'm going to leave that there. There's some interesting talking points. People will come in with different points of view. It's going to be a very divisive subject. But it's very, very hard to have a balanced debate with the far right and the hard left gaining in popularity, and they want to seem not to have that debate with the other side calmly. They always want to attack and smear campaigns, and it's getting a bit depressing. Most people in the middle are just generally frustrated. A lot of people are voting for these parties out of pure protest at the political system and their economic system of the country they're in, which is their right to do. We're seeing a lot of strikes in France right now. They're getting very violent. People have actually lost their lives. There's a lot of issues socially in France, which is a big EU member. There's issues in Italy with high youth unemployment in the south. Other parts of Europe is at 40% youth unemployment, which is not sustainable for the long term. So there we go, that's some debating points. Thank you very much for watching. It's not normal that I do a video this long on this channel, but there's a lot to talk about, and there's still more to talk about with Brexit officially, UK leaving the EU in exactly 4 months. There's 4 months to go. There's a lot to sort out. The EU member states have agreed to it. It's now down to the UK Parliament and these whiny people who want another referendum, which I don't think actually helps the situation. I think we have to, as the UK, accept the deal and move on. The funny thing is, the UK doesn't have to actually leave the EU. It can withdraw its Article 50 application, and the referendum wasn't legally binding, but no one seems to really pay attention to any of this. The rhetoric coming out from both sides isn't great. It's a toxic relationship going forward. But because of the EU's refusal to reform itself and be more flexible with member states, it's led itself to this point. And I wouldn't be surprised if these populist parties gaining momentum, and there's a lot to be said about a key member state in Italy having a populist five-star movement as its main party, and they're not having the happiest relationship with the EU at the moment. So there we go. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Place your thoughts below, and I'll have some more videos for you soon.